area, the urban LA area. Okay. And, those areas aren't as developed as they are now, but they were filling in. So, testing any kind of secret aircraft, in the, sort of in the middle of the LA basin was not very secret, was it? I mean, that's essentially where you get Area 51, isn't it? I mean,
that's right.
You would tend to find more and more remote places to take these projects away from prying eyes. Well, I mean, Giant Rock Airport, which is sort of out north of Palm Springs, not too far from 29 Palms, just sort of situated in that area, near Landers, California. It's still there. There's still the Giant Rock, and there's still Van Tassel's building, his Integratron, and there's still an airfield there. But what he did was to basically go out and take over what was then a very isolated, but nonetheless 5,000-foot hard-surfaced airfield, which was used for sport pilots and others. But it got me thinking that, if you wanted to find a place in 1947 that was out of the way, but not too far from Los Angeles, not too far from the main facilities of Hughes or Northrop or whatever it might be, where experiments might be carried out, that might not be a bad place to have. And it would be even better if you had one of your longtime loyal employees who was put in charge of it. Then think also how it might help to develop the whole reputation of flying saucers in the area, that this was a center for them coming, so that in case anybody did see something, you've got a built-in cover story of what it was. Okay, so you can see, and now those are just all suppositions. Nothing there is fact beyond the fact that Giant Rock Airport exists. George Van Tassel worked for Hughes. He took it over in 1947, and he ran it for years afterwards. So this is eventually what sort of drew my attention to Williamson. And the other thing about him was that Williamson is, well, he's one of these characters that interests me because for some reason, in a lot of my research, I tend to be fascinated by pathological liars. I'm not quite sure why. I think part of it is that it's always interesting to see what people can get other people to believe, and what makes some people more convincing than others. So in the case of Williamson, I sort of approached him the way I would approach anybody else, and there are sort of, three basic different possibilities about anybody. One is that the first thing you should do is to assume that whatever they say, they're basically telling the truth. Okay? The other is you don't go into with the assumption right away that this person is lying or that they're absolutely, but you assume that what they say, that essentially they're authentic. Now, what things might lead you to believe that a person isn't a trustworthy narrator, that they're not authentic? Well, one of those things is if you can find them in lies. That is, if you can catch them in cases where they're telling obvious falsehoods or they're exaggerating. And in the case of Williamson, I have to say, his entire career is permeated with that. He tends to lie one way or the other about pretty much everything, but not totally. There's usually some sort of kernel of truth of what he's saying, but that again leads that there's simply a lot of falsehood in what he's saying, and there are in many cases they're pretty easily demonstrable falsehoods. And to give you one example of that, one of the things that the story changes as time goes on, but he would usually claim in his public appearances or in his written works that he held various academic degrees, usually in archaeology or anthropology, and he would name various universities where he attained these degrees, and so far as I've been able to tell, he doesn't have any of them. And I've looked. And the other thing that I found is that he doesn't simply make up degrees. He makes up entire universities.
Huh.
So,
especially at a time then, how would you go about that? It's not like you could set it up online, a fake diploma that they sell for a paper mill or degree mill for like $1,200.
That's pretty much what he mentions. There are two universities that he mentions affiliation with. One is a place called Williams College, which is in Berkeley. And that was a real place. There was a Williams College. It wasn't a university. It was a kind of art school. It was a private art and literature school, which did offer courses on various esoteric subjects. But it was also the place, if anybody knows who the dancer Isadora Duncan was, well, she taught classes there way back in time. And that was the same place that Williamson later claimed. He claimed at one point to be the dean, I think, of esoteric studies at Williams College. And there was never anything, there was no department he could have been dean of. But there was a college. It went out of business, though, in the late 1960s. And another college that he claimed to have gotten a PhD from was a place called Avon University in Boston. There was an Avon University. But in the early 60s, I found out that the Massachusetts State Attorney General was eventually going after it for being what you just described, which was a diploma mill, and an unaccredited institution that for a certain financial sum would issue one degree or another. And in Florida, I even found a place later in the 1960s where Williams is personally involved in an attempt to set up one of these diploma mills in Florida. In fact, he's on the board of directors. So he seems to have a long-term association with this type of thing. So that was the thing. So in approaching it, is he authentic? Well, one of the things I can find out about him is he lies about a lot of things.
Yeah.
All right.
That's
so that then means, and that's just the tip of the iceberg, really. But he tells blatant falsehoods, and that is one of those things that then impugns his credibility elsewhere. It doesn't mean that he's lying about everything else, but it certainly doesn't help. So if he's not authentic, what are the other two possibilities? Well, the second one is that, maybe he's crazy. I mean, there are different ways you can put that. There are all sorts of terms for it, megalomaniac or fantasist, or my favorite, mythomaniac, or pathological liar. But what that basically implies is that there's some sort of mental condition going. It's not exactly the same as saying that the person is mentally ill, but that they have some kind of mental condition which leads them to tell these repeated falsehoods and to live in a kind of fantasy world. And one of the things, that's sort of buried just beneath the surface in a term like fantasist or mythomaniac is the possibility that even though they're lying, they don't quite know that they're lying. The idea that the illness or the mental condition here is something that leads them to actually create a kind of fantasy world in which, they're basically spewing BS, but they somehow don't quite realize it. Now, the third possibility, though, is that they're what I'll call a charlatan. They're a fake, pure and simple. They're not crazy. They're not authentic. They are, in some respects, a kind of con man. But there are different levels to that as well. I describe a charlatan as someone who, a good definition was someone who attempts to gain money, fame, or advantage under pretense or deception. So they might be after money if it's a con. They might do it simply because it makes them feel better about themselves. But that they know what they're doing. There's no idea here that they're just somehow poor, deluded fools who are taken in by their own fantasies. That they are lying, and they are lying deliberately, and maybe this is the key point, they are lying for a purpose. So that purpose could be to defraud someone, to get money out of them. Now, I have to say, if that's what it was that Williamson was trying to do, he appears to have been very, very bad at it.
Yeah.
Because I can't find any instance where he got lots of money off of defrauding people.
But later on in his life, he was able to marry someone of significant stature. So that, I would think, brought him some money.
He had a tendency, and this is the type of thing that, again, it takes us off in another direction. I can see in the case of Adamski as well, is that they have a tendency to, I'm going to be delicate how I say this, they have a particular ability to exploit women of a particular sort of disposition. They appear to have consistently been able to sort of, manipulate women into doing their bidding, which I guess isn't really that unusual, is it?
No.
Especially
then, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the same sort of thing that in a
Look at
slightly different
Onassis,
context.
too. Look at Onassis. I mean, he was able to woo the woman, very much so. A lot of them, in fact.
Yeah,
All the way up,
look at
up
Charlie
to...
Manson.
Yeah, that's right. He had a whole group
Okay.
of them. And not only did he get his own needs, he used the woman to get what he wanted from, say,
Yes.
bikers and musicians, etc.
One of the things you often have to look at with these characters, and I do think there's a kind of syndrome in it, and I don't want to draw an exact, but one of the things to look for is you'll have this kind of key male figure, and he'll have sort of male subordinates, but he doesn't have many of them. Okay, the other males around him are relatively few in number, and none of them come anywhere near his stature. What he's really surrounded by is this kind of coterie of devoted females. That's what really makes his whole organization or cult run. And in the case of George Hunt Williamson, one of the first women who sort of falls under his spell is his first and kind of tragic wife, Betty Jane, who he's married to for a number of years. And then, at the very end of his life, he's kind of living as a house guest of this elderly woman, a dozen or so years his elder in Long Beach, who has money and gives him a roof over his head and food to eat by the name of Thelma Dunlap, who also, interestingly enough, worked for Howard Hughes at one time.
Wow.
But that's the thing I would keep bumping into.
The aerospace mogul of the era.
Yes, an aerospace mogul, and keep in mind a man of somewhat, vaguely mystical bent.
Yeah.
I mean, let's put it this way. The one thing that everybody pretty much agreed upon about Howard Hughes is that he was a genius and he was weird.
Germaphobe, too. Yeah. Weird is an understatement for Hughes.
Weird covers a lot of waterfront here, but I think somewhere Howard Hughes fits on that waterfront of weird. He was a very sort of strange individual with interests that would kind of overlap with these. And, of course, the other thing about his company is that not only was it involved in the development of aircraft and rocketry, but it was also connected with things like the CIA. All right? What was it? Was the Glomar Explorer? Remember the submarine that was lost? That at some point, I think in the 70s, they were trying to fish out of the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. They were trying to recover this submarine. And that was a whole sort of secret project.
Wait, you mean ours or the Soviet one? Because I know the CIA
I think we were trying to pull up. If I remember, we were trying to pull up a sunken Russian submarine.
That's what I remember. Yes, that's what I read.
But that again was all one of these kind of hush hush projects that are going on. So this is, see, the thing that interests me in this again is, not to dismiss the entire possibility, but that's why I'm not trying to I'm not concerned about here whether there's an objective reality to extraterrestrial spacecraft or not. All right. But whether there is something else at work in all of this, whether within all of this process there are things, there is industrial and international espionage, there are indeed spies who work in this. And the other thing, and it comes back to this point about what a charlatan does, remember, someone who lies deliberately. Another purpose of deliberate falsehoods is disinformation.
Yeah.
That is, and which is different than misinformation. Misinformation is something that's just wrong. It's a mistake. Disinformation is something that's wrong, but it's not a mistake. It's deliberately wrong. It is information which is designed under the guise of informing to subtly disinform. Or the best way that I've ever heard it put, the basic aim of all good disinformation is to lead the hounds away from the fox, to send people off into another direction. So, one of the things when you look at a lot of the early UFO stories, whether they're Adamski meeting a blonde Venusian, out in the desert in 1952, and Williamson was supposedly along for that little venture, or whether it's William's later stories. William never said he met an alien in the flesh. No, he communicated them with radios, Ouija boards, and automatic writing.
Interesting. I never heard
Yeah.
of Ouija boards being used to communicate with UFOs. Now, channeling, even then, Ouija board, that's what it's meant to do. It's supposed to channel a
Yeah.
dead entity. And, that's one thing I always ask people who are involved in ghost hunting. I had two questions. One, have you ever come across a ghost that speaks in a dead language? Two, the biggest question I'm always the most curious about. Has anyone who's ever been involved in ghost hunting come across a ghost of a dead extraterrestrial?
I don't know. Now, George Van Tassel also communicated with aliens through seances.
Yeah, definitely he did.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, he built the Integratron because of them.
Yeah, partly, and he would hold seances in the rooms under. Giant Rock is not only, for those who don't know, a giant rock. It also has kind of a house built underneath it. It has rooms that eventually had been excavated by a previous owner who died violently, but that's another story. So that was the other thing that tended to strike me. The other thing that I've run across a lot in my research, and someone like Crowley, remember, Crowley's whole story is where the occult and espionage sort of blend into each other. So it wasn't uncommon for you to find those things, connected. In fact, it's almost where you find one. If you look closely enough, you're probably going to find the other one not very far away. So when I began to look more closely at this, I found out that, Williamson, used radio, but he also, and as time went on, he basically, so they started out using a Ouija board, and then they just, did the Ouija board without the Ouija board, which is channeling. He heard, the other way to put it, he heard a voice in his head, and he wrote down what the voice told him. Automatic writing was about. But see, this is something that's so much older than anything involved with UFOs or flying saucers or any of this. This again is one of those things. This type of stuff is hundreds, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of years old. Who knows how long humans have been hearing voices in their heads, or getting contact from discarnate entities of one form or another. So when you then look, in the late 40s and 50s, and you look at a lot of this early contactee experience, what it is that it's simply sort of ritual occultism under a different name. And that was the other thing that struck me, again, if you go back and look at these early aliens who tend to be, first of all, very humanoid, all right? They're all sort of beautiful men and women. They're physically beautiful, and they are, highly advanced, not just technologically, but more importantly, the thing that's always emphasized is that they're highly advanced spiritually, and they're here to help us and guide our spiritual advancement.
When you say humanoid, Dr. Spence, real quick, are you referring to, like Adamski said, that he was visited by people who look just like you and I, maybe a little bigger eyes, blonde hair, blue eyes, etc.?
Right. In fact, they're almost always what are called Nordics. Yes. The Venusians are blonde, and and then you've got another example will be at one of these early contactees that Williamson had. He had associations with almost all of them. So this again is where I will hopefully develop this more as we go on. But that Williamson is a kind of gadfly in that he's briefly connected to Adamski. He has a longer relationship with Van Tassel, Bethram, Daniel Fry, John McCoy, others. He knows virtually everybody in that field at the time. That's also kind of interesting. In fact, he, as an individual, more threads seem to connect to him than connect anybody else. That is, it's sort of like all of these people in some way have been sort of touched or cultivated by Williams at one point in time. So that's just kind of a thought to hold on to. But the thing about someone like Bethram, his story is that he's she's not from Venus. No, she's from one of the other, Earth-like planets, Clarion, I think. All right. And the names of these characters are all, they don't sound like anything that would be spoken in an alien. I would think words in alien languages might be a little stranger than that. It sounds like Earth people trying to come up with slightly weird names. So he claims he had contact with a beautiful saucer pilot. I think here her name was Aura Raines, or Ronnies. The last name is spelled Rhanes. So however you pronounce that. But the whole point is, here you have this really ordinary, and I would have to say in all fairness, pretty schlubby-looking guy who claims that he's receiving regular visits from an extraordinarily beautiful space woman who, of course, he becomes romantically involved with. Now, that is just pretty hard to believe. Okay? I mean, it's a story which, even at the time, so far as I'm able to tell, most people thought was slightly ridiculous. But the whole, within the greater realm of the thing, there's a great deal of tolerance that seems to have been shown towards people with various stories. But when you look at a lot of these things, they're even Adamski's contact. And again, this is, for George Adamski, I'd have to say that my sort of agnostic's take on him, my historian's take on him, is that George Adamski was from beginning to end a pure, unadulterated con man. And I would base that on the fact that he had been running cons before he ever got into the whole saucer racket. If you go back to the 1930s, he's involved in Laguna Beach with a thing called the Royal Order of Tibet, and claims to have been taken as a child to Tibet, and which he never was. Okay, you can figure out exactly where he grew up in upstate New York. I mean, again, these sort of creation of these tall tales, and the Royal Order of Tibet basically built money out of gullible people in the guise of handing them spiritual enlightenment. And I think later on he was just doing exactly the same thing in more modern dress. Now, that doesn't mean that despite himself in some cases, he might have had some kind of authentic contact with something, but if he did, it was pretty much accidental. And I think, by the way, that's why Williamson's contact with Adamski was as brief as it was, because he very quickly sized him up as a fake. But that's one of the things in looking at this sort of early phenomenon. I mean, people, in many places are seeing all kinds of strange things. I mean, there seems to be no doubt that that the various sightings are going on. But the people who very often come forward and most visibly exploit those stories by writing books, or like Williamson did, writing books and going on speaking tours and developing a kind of personal following around themselves, there, in most cases, it's pretty obvious flim-flammery. There's no getting around the fact that there's an incredible amount of fakery that goes along with this. Which is not, I think that there is a danger there to dismiss everything as being a fake. But on the other hand, you can't accept everything simply as being legitimate. There are just a lot of people making up stories and lying about things. And I come back to this question, are they doing this because they're all crazy in some way? Okay, this is all some manifestation of a weirdly prevalent psychological syndrome they all share. Or even if they are all charlatans, is part of this work disinformation? I mean, standing back and looking at it from what I think is, hopefully a somewhat more dispassionate view, I look at all this stuff, and is that if someone was trying to make the whole issue about UFOs look as ridiculous as possible and make people feel foolish for having anything to do with it, I would go out and have people tell stories like that.
Ridicule them, especially in those times.
Yes.
I mean, now people can talk about it. Almost every major cable network, History, National Geographic, Travel Channel, Destination America, A&E, they cover these topics. This would not have happened, say, 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago at all. You would be thrown under the bus as someone who belongs in a puzzle factory.
Yeah, but one of the things that helped people do that is that most of these early stories are just that ridiculous. I mean, they involve improbable meetings with improbably human-like beings speaking improbably. I mean, none of it really makes much of the sense, and maybe we live into the tyranny of logic, which makes us insist that everything makes sense. But when I look at those stories, most of the early contact stories, they sound like bad science fiction. That's been something else you'll often find is that Adamski had actually dabbled in science fiction. Before he ever had his first flying saucer contact, he'd written stories about it. And a pretty good argument can be made is that what he did with his initial contact with Orthon the Venusian was just adapt a story that he'd written some years before. All right? But the stories they're easy to ridicule. And I just wonder, if not in every case, but in some cases, are they easy to ridicule because that's specifically what they're designed to be? They are designed to be easily ridiculed stories that then get they seem to get most of the public attention and are really sort of, could be arguably used as a form of disinformation to diminish any kind of serious interest in them. To essentially make the stories look ludicrous, and anybody who would believe them look like a fool. Now, again, it comes down to how much of that is accidental and how much of it is deliberate. But that again is where George Hunt Williamson. Well, let's go back to the beginning with George Hunt Williamson. And the thing is that one of the things that he does, another thing I found interesting about him, is that he just becomes different people during his life. I mean, in 1962, for instance, he will just drop being George Hunt Williamson. I mean, George Hunt Williamson, there were people who believed that George Hunt Williamson died in 1961 because his name never showed up again, and he never wrote any more books, and he never gave any more talks. Well, in a sense, George Hunt Williamson did die because that whole persona was put on the shelf, and it was replaced by a completely new persona. And in the place of George Hunt Williamson, that same individual now became Michel Dobrenovich, all right? Which is, not similar at all. But not just Michel Dobrenovich, but Michel Dobrenovich, who claimed to be the Duke of Sumadja and the rightful heir to the thrones of Serbia and Bosnia. His Royal Highness Michel Dobrenovich. And that from 62 until his death in 1986 is how the former George Hunt Williamson was known. Now, maybe we can explain later how he became this other person, but going back in the other direction, you find out that George Hunt Williamson didn't really begin his life as George Hunt Williamson. No, he began his life in 1926 in Chicago, Illinois, as the only son of a fairly well-to-do upper-middle-class professional family, and he was George Leonard Williamson, Jr. That's who he really was. And as far as I can tell, even through his passports, that's who he officially was. That's still who he really was, all the way up until 1962. Because his passports seem to have been issued in his original name, which figures because he would have to produce an authentic birth certificate in order to get one, and his birth certificate said that his name was George Leonard Williamson, Jr. So where does the Hunt come in? The Hunt was his mother's maiden name, so he essentially added his mother's name as a middle name, and he seems to have done that pretty early on, but so one of the things I did with him is what I'll do with most people that I'm interested in. I start collecting information and I compile a chronology. Mm-hmm. I try to map out where they were. Okay, so they're born here and they die here, and then what other things can we find? What other markers do we have in between? Now, there are two places that you can tend to look for those markers. One is in some kind of public records. You can look in census records. You can, look in death records, Social Security records, military records, if you can get a hold of them, educational records. Those will give you detail. Those official documents are interesting because they'll tell you, if someone has a real name, if they have a legal name, that's what's on the documents. And that's where sometimes you find out that someone's actual name is different than the one that they're using publicly. The other place that you can find information is sort of in the public, not in public records, but in the public record, which are basically in newspapers. Now, you don't want to believe everything you read in the newspapers, but on the other hand, what a newspaper can tell you, for instance, is that George Hunt Williamson gave a talk on flying saucers or gave a talk on ancient civilizations in San Mateo, California, on the 14th of February, 1955. And it may tell you who sponsored that talk. It might tell you whether or not there were donations or whether admission was charged. Might give you an idea as to where it was held, in a school auditorium. You can get a sense of how big an audience is as to what the venue is. So, if a talk is being given in in a room in a local library, that's probably a much smaller talk than something which is given at a local high school auditorium, for instance. So what you can do is that you can compile those pieces of information, and you can kind of map things out, and you can find out. Okay, you can put them places. That's what. Okay, on this particular date they were in Florida. On this particular date they were in Philadelphia. On this particular date they were in Peru. All right, they went here. They started to travel here, and then you can find gaps. Those are often the most interesting things you find. A period of time in which someone who's normally pretty busy just kind of disappears for a while.
How long or how big are these gaps that you found?
Well, in Williamson's case, the gaps, generally, I would say maybe a few months. I mean, actually, his life is probably easier to kind of build a chronology around because for the first half of it, up until 1962, he gave a lot of interviews in the press. That is, his name shows up in newspapers fairly often. And, you can even find things about him in yearbooks. So here's an example. One of the first pieces of sort of tangible information, the first piece of hard information I found was his high school Chicago high school yearbooks. In yearbooks, you got a picture of people, but yearbooks also give a little bit of information about people. Not only tells you that they were in that school, it sometimes tells you, what were their activities, what kind of clubs did they belong to. So what was the thing that jumped out at me when I looked at his high school yearbook from Chicago in the 1940s? Well, what was his most clear association? Drama club. He was a budding actor.
Go figure.
He was involved in I think about three different productions.
Movie or stage or...
Well, this is just, these are high school this is a high school drama production.
Okay.
But you've got people, and lots of people, but it's, what might the thing you want to look for later on? Here's a guy who, as a kid, shows a certain bug for performing, for playing characters. So one of the things that you can do, if you want to get kind of Freudian about it, is you can argue is that, here's someone who has a kind of acting bug, and if you look at the rest of their life, in a way, what Williamson does is that he plays a series of characters. He plays, a soldier. He plays a family man. He plays an Indiana Jones explorer in the wilds of South America. He plays a mystical seeker founding monasteries in the Andes. He plays college student. He plays channeler and contactee, and then later on he plays Serbian royalty. It's like one act following another. Now, the thing about it is that again, you could argue, you could say, well, that's the manifestation of some kind of mental aberration. This is somebody who's, maybe they have, this is where the pop Freudianism always comes in, and these are simply the ideas that may be popping into people's heads. Well, this is a guy who's, he would fit into the concept that he's a kind of fantasist, that he lives in a dream world, that he imagines himself as different people, and so he begins to take on these personas and play roles. The question, again, for me, is whether or not he's doing that through some sort of compulsion, or whether he's doing it with some sort of purpose in mind. And the other thing about it goes back to the things we were talking about, whether someone is authentic or crazy or a charlatan. The lines between those three possibilities are not always exact, especially the line between crazy and con man. Because you can argue that, in a way, to really be a successful con man, to be good at being a charlatan, to make your lies convincing, you have to believe them. You have to be, in other words, a good actor. So one of the ways to think of it is that a basic desire or talent at acting, the ability to project other sort of personalities on yourself, has an application in all kinds of things. And the other thing, another area where I know that has a practical application, along with the other ones, is espionage. Because one of the things, again, that any good spy, that is, any person sent into a situation to disseminate or collect information without the others around them knowing it, has to be able to do convincingly, is play a role. And a person who has either the talent or the compulsion to be an actor is really sort of ideally suited for that. I mean, part of being the kind of spy that I think Williamson might have been would necessitate him being an actor. So I mentioned the fact that he had, the other thing that it mentions, I mentioned him having contact with the military, or playing the role of a soldier or a military man, which is also this kind of role that he keeps bringing up throughout his career. And that goes back to 1945. So 1945, then George Leonard Williamson is about 19 years old. World War II is coming to a close, and for whatever reason, maybe he wanted to be part of the greatest generation. Maybe he didn't have anything else to do at the time. In June 1945, he enlists, he is not drafted, enlists in the U.S. Army Air Force. Now, a little detail that many people know, but sometimes is overlooked, is that in 1945, the Air Force, or what would become the Air Force 2 years later, was part of the Army. So in 1945, what he joins is the U.S. Army, but he joins the Air Force. It would have been called the Air Corps. And then in 1947, that magical year, the Air Force will become a separate service. So he enlists in the Army Air Force. He's only in it for, the war ends and there's pretty quickly demobilization. So he's out by November 1946. So he's in service for about 18 months. He is technically a World War II vet. But he serves in the Air Force, the Army Air Force, and it was interesting. And he's stationed in two places. He volunteers or enlists in Illinois, and then he's sent to Lowry Field near Denver. And then later on, he's sent from Denver back to Illinois to Scott Field, or Scott Air Force Base. Now, what's significant about those places? Both of them were involved in technical training for the Army Air Force. And in particular, both Lowry Field and Scott Field hosted large radio schools. There are other things you could learn there, but the most prominent thing they had were people who went to radio schools. And that, I think, is almost certainly what it was that he received his military training in, because for the rest of his life, or certainly for the decade that follows that, he shows a strong interest and aptitude in radio communications. In fact, he'll work for a radio station in the early 1950s. So he has this early connection to the military, but that's, and a lot of other people did. I mean, at that point, there's nothing really unusual about that guy who enlists at the end of the war, sent off for some technical training. The war is over. He's out. I found something interesting, little details hidden in things like enlistment papers. One of the things it notes is that when he enlisted, he had 3 years of high school. He was not a high school graduate.
Interesting.
Which would mean that he must have dropped out of high school. Because, again, he's at least 18, 19. He should have finished high school by that point, and he didn't. Which, I don't know, maybe is why he enlisted in the Army Air Force. Which is also intriguing because he later gets into a university, so he must have gotten his GED, either when he was in the military or soon after that. So by November 1946, he's out of the Army Air Force. He's back home in Chicago, and he's living with his parents. And soon after that, his father, who's done quite well, designing radio cabinets and being an interior designer, decided he's going to move the whole family to Prescott, Arizona. So in 1947, they move off to Arizona, and that's sort of going to begin the next phase of Williamson's life. And the interesting thing, though, is that not as George Leonard Williamson, nor as George Hunt Williamson, but under his later incarnation of Michel Dobrenovich, he is buried, or his ashes are interred, in Arlington Cemetery. And the thing that I find interesting about it is that in Arlington Cemetery, he is Michel Dobrenovich, a name under which he never did any military service for the United States, but that's the name on his tombstone. And it does not say Army Air Force 1945 to 1946. It says Second Lieutenant U.S. Army Infantry.
Huh. And you know what? The name that he's interred by obviously sounds Soviet, especially in that era. It is a real Serbian name. You know, he's the Obrenović family really was a royal family of Serbia. But it is, I can guarantee you, it is a family that which he has no biological connection whatsoever. Okay, this is another one of these big whopping lies he comes up with. And I can say I fairly checked that out. It supposedly comes on his mother's side of the family. His mother in 1959 supposedly wrote out, or he told her to write this whole story that she was told by her sister and her mother, how they were all descended from Wilhelm Obrenovich, who changed his name to Osborne. There's a whole long... And so I sort of checked that from two sides. One, the Obrenovich family itself and all of the different branches of that, the real historical Obrenovici. And there are a lot of them. None of them are in any way connected to the Osbornes or George Hunt Williamson. And then his own mother's family, which can be pretty easily just traced through census records all the way back to the late 18th century. Okay, I mean, they're about as pretty much as Anglo-American as, apple pie. There's not a Serbian in the woodpile anywhere that I can find. But he would go to rather elaborate lengths to sort of create some kind of pseudo-documentary background for this whole kinds of shift. And, that's another one of those things that you have to think, well, did he do that because, again, it's just some sort of aspect of craziness? Did he just actually believe somehow he was this person? Well, it's either that or he did it deliberately for some type of purpose. And one of the things that would allow him to do is that it would allow him to begin to associate himself free of all the connections he had with, flying saucer loving George Hunt Williamson, to leave all of that behind and now begin to kind of, you could say, infiltrate a different group of people with a different name. But this whole thing about his burial in Arlington. Now, and I've talked to some people about this, and presumably there would have to be records substantiating that he was a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army Infantry. I mean, I don't think you can just get into Arlington and get something on your tombstone or, in your memorial just for any rank you would want, or everybody would be a general. And it fits with a couple of other things. It fits with, in his own papers and other references, he says that in 1949, some years, 4 years later, 1949, in Arizona, that he is recalled to military service for about 6 months. And when he's recalled to military service, he is given a second lieutenant's commission. Now, a second lieutenant is the, bottom basement level of an army officer, but it nevertheless is an officer. It's not an enlisted man. And in his previous service for the Army Air Force, he was never more than enlisted. He never got anywhere near being an officer. So now, 3 or 4 years later, in Arizona, this guy is supposedly given a second lieutenant's commission in the Army. I don't quite get that as to why it wouldn't have been in the then more recently established Air Force. And I can actually find a newspaper article from 1949 where he is referred to as Second Lieutenant George Hunt Williamson. Now, what makes that complicated, though, is that in the newspaper article, he's referred to as a second lieutenant, but he's only talked about in connection not with the Army, but with the Civil Air Patrol. And that's one of those things which I think, there are probably listeners who are familiar with the Civil Air Patrol. It's still very much around. It was
created or restructured after World War II as the official civilian auxiliary to the U.S. Air Force. So it's not part of the Air Force. People in the Civil Air Patrol, if they have ranks, don't have Air Force ranks. They're essentially complementary ranks. But it is recognized as a civilian auxiliary to the Air Force. So yeah, I would say it is, if not strictly military, it's quasi-military, closely connected to the Air Force in many ways. And senior members within the sort of administrative elite within the Civil Air Patrol do have ranks, and they go all the way up to all the way up to colonel. And by the end of his career, he claimed the rank of lieutenant colonel. So he had continued to advance. Now I know, for instance, that if he was a lieutenant back in 1949, by the middle of the 1960s, he's still involved with the Civil Air Patrol elsewhere in the country, and by that time he's a captain.
Now, you said lieutenant colonel. A lot of people who are career officers retire with the title of lieutenant colonel. They don't actually even get to serve that unless I don't even know how that would work. I mean, I only have a sibling who was in the military, but I know you do have to go through OCS, Officer Candidate School, but to make it to lieutenant colonel while you're serving is a big feat.
It would be a big feat. Now, keep in mind, he was a lieutenant colonel in the Civil Air Patrol, not in the Air Force. And so, a lieutenant colonel in the Civil Air Patrol, again, is essentially a civilian courtesy rank. It's not an actual military rank. Now the thing is that given Williamson's tendency to, let's say, tell tall tales about himself or to exaggerate things, I would be willing to assume that the ranks that he ever held, outside of the private in the Army Air Force during World War II, those were all Civil Air Patrol ranks. But still, there's that fact that he's buried in Arlington as a second lieutenant, U.S. Army Infantry. And why he would have been called back in 1949 for a few months and given an officer's commission is still one of those things that I'm trying to figure out. But here's what that just hints at to me. Here's what makes me curious about it, and it's one of these reasons, it's one of these bones I want to keep chewing on, is that I think there's more to that story. And, when I see someone who is pulled back for no, obvious reason into a short term of military service and they're given an officer's rank, that gives them a certain amount of, second lieutenant doesn't carry much clout, but it gives them the ability to boss enlisted personnel around. It would place them. One thing it may connect to is that he was also somewhere in that period, he notes that he was an instructor for the U.S. Armed Forces Institute, which was a kind of correspondence school for the military. I mean, it was one of those things developed during World War II, and I think still continues, that military men could essentially take college-level courses, or they could complete their high school education through what were then would be online courses today, but correspondence courses at the time. And this seems to correspond with the same period he was doing that. So what I suspect was probably happening is that he was briefly made an instructor of some kind, and he was given the second lieutenant's rank while he was an instructor. And that was, again, to, I suppose, sort of elevate him in some way over the ordinary airmen or soldiers that he was instructing. But so there's that connection to the military, which never quite goes away. The other thing to me that's the little bell that goes off whenever I hear Civil Air Patrol is David Ferry. And that's one of those names that crops up in something that I almost hesitate to mention more than flying saucers, which is the JFK assassination. Because if you look into this murky character sort of on the edges of the JFK conspiracies, and especially the sort of Clay Shaw, New Orleans, Jim Garrison conspiracy, you've got this very weird character by the name of David Ferry, who was, just like George Hunt Williamson, an officer in the Civil Air Patrol, and that seems to have been a cover for all sorts of interesting things. They also share something else in common. Another connection, for whatever it may be worth, between George Hunt Williamson and David Ferrie, alleged JFK conspirator, is that both of them subsequently became consecrated as wandering bishops.
Wandering bishops?
Wandering bishops. Okay. Episcopi vagantes. So what's a wandering bishop? Wandering bishops are basically a whole class of nominally, and I emphasize that term nominally, Christian bishops, mostly in obscure Orthodox or Eastern Rite Christian denominations, who become bishops basically through consecration by another bishop in that rite. But they're not part, generally, they don't have to be part of any church. So it all goes back to this idea that, for the idea that this goes back to the earliest times of Christianity, when the church consisted of often widely separated congregations, and bishops would consecrate other people as bishops. I'm a bishop. I touch you in the head and I go, you're a bishop. It's more complicated than that, but that's the basic thing. Now, sometimes people would say you have to have other bishops watch you or maybe even assist you. But basically, from ancient times, from the very origins of the Christian church, bishops consecrated other bishops. Now, over the centuries, almost all bishops have been consecrated within, let's say, the corporate structure of something like the Roman Catholic Church or the Russian Orthodox Church, etc. But any bishop can, theoretically, consecrate anybody else as a bishop. And that
I was going to say that.
And that person doesn't have to be within the framework of the church. So you end up with the guy, by the way, for anybody who's interested, who's written the most on this is Peter Levenda.
Yes, great guy. Yes. He's been on the show many times, and he's always got a lot of information. I consider him to be one of the extreme intelligent guests such as yourself.
And Peter Levenda, I give him credit. Peter Levenda, I think, is the only person who has ever given any serious attention to this sort of wandering bishop phenomenon. So the thing is that the wandering bishops are technically people who aren't, they're bishops. The Catholic Church or the Russian Orthodox Church or most any other church might argue that, well, they're not real bishops because, they don't have a real job inside of a real church, but of course they don't see it that way. And the other thing about them is they often get multiple consecrations. Yeah, they'll get 3 or 4 or 5 or 7 or 8 different consecrations. As if one wasn't quite. If I've been consecrated 8 times, then I'm a bishop. But the reason why I know I've come across these before is because they tend to show up with fairly regular appearance for no particular reason in intelligence circles. There seem to be a lot of people sort of on the fringe of mid-20th century espionage who for some reason or other decided that they needed to be consecrated as a kind of, bishop in the ancient apostolic, Chaldean church of one form or another. And that's usually the names of their organizations are like the American Orthodox Catholic Church, and then Williamson will later, as Dobrenovich, form his own, basically make himself a patriarch of his own church called the Holy Orthodox Catholic Church, which he sets up in Santa Barbara, California.
That's where you in fact met him in the 70s, right?
That's where that's yet another thing that I guess one of the reasons I got especially intrigued about him was that back long ago in the 1970s, when I was a lowly history PhD student at the University of California in Santa Barbara, I was studying, of course, the thing I was interested in was in Russian and Eastern European history, and therefore, within the graduate program at UCSB, I was technically part of something called the Balkan Studies Program. It was a bit more than that, but it was formally called the Balkan Studies Program. And the guy who was my major professor and who was the head of that was a professor of history named Dmitry Georgievich, who was Yugoslav, Serbian, to be specific. All right? And so one of the things that Georgievich, being a history professor and, being involved in all things Serbian American, would catch up on, if there was somebody running around Santa Barbara claiming to be the rightful king of Serbia, well, Dmitri would have heard about that, and apparently he did. And the only thing I can remember, and what I can't recall now, is whether this happened before or after my brief little, introduction to Michel Dubranovich, as he was called then, was, Georgievich's view was that, this guy's, a fraud. Okay, he's, he didn't take him seriously at all. I mean, it wasn't even like there was a huge discussion about it, but that, I can't remember exactly what was said, but he was pretty easily dismissed. What I do remember, the one sort of thing that would actually, the one, it's kind of odd how memory works, because you forget a lot of stuff, and then there are these odd, things you can remember. The only thing with any clarity about that is that it was at some sort of reception. There were a lot of those. It might have been a party at somebody's house that grad students would get invited to, because we always went there because there was free alcohol and food. Mm-hmm. But while I was there, I would just sort of briefly, it was someone saying, oh, this is Michael, I think they called him Dubranovich. And all I remember was, sort of briefly having this guy sort of introduced to me. I don't know that we shook hands or not. What I do remember was the person who introduced us. And the person who introduced me to him was a retired, guess what, Air Force officer.
Ha! Go figure. Something that he served in.
Well, yeah, he was that, and he was also an Air Force officer who had been, I eventually figured out, had actually been stationed at Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico. During the same period of time that Williamson was sort of in Arizona and New Mexico. He was also a guy, he was technically in the graduate program, and I'm not going to use his name. I know what it is. Just because there are other parts of his family around, and I just feel weird about saying that about someone I actually know. He was always very nice to me, but one of the questions that later came up was that, his first name was Chet, and the question was, well, what exactly is Colonel Chet doing in the program? I mean, he was very close to Georgievich, and he was a master's student for a while, but he was, very much involved with the students and the rest of it, and there were a couple of people who later, I never thought much about it at the time, thought that part of his job was that he was a talent scout.
Looking for others. Real quick, before we pick up on that, let me ask you some questions here real quick. Angie from New Jersey, can you ask him about hybrids and our government involvement? Well,
you could. There's not much I could tell you about that. I mean, are there alien-human hybrids? The only thing, again, from an agnostic's point of view, I mean, let's put it this way. I haven't seen one. Nobody's ever shown me any kind of convincing evidence that would make me believe that the case. Is it conceivable? Yeah, sure it is. But, I mean, I think that's, and I don't really mean to seem waffling on that, but I really think that's the kind of way that you should really approach these things, is to simply go by, to understand that most things are really a range of possibilities in that case. I mean, let's put it this way. We now know within our scientific knowledge as mere earthlings that we can, trade genes and splice DNA between species, and there's talk about the creation of chimeras, human-animal hybrids, and there's probably a lot more work being done about that, black budget-wise, than it would be healthy to know about. But sure, if we can do it.
And Plum Island, right? Plum Island is known for chimeras, or at least the alleged is the key word. Yeah.
Well, I mean, there is work going on now that's publicly discussed, which involves, the combination of human and animal DNA. I mean, that is kind of openly contemplated, and it is, I think, probably more than theoretically possible. It has probably actually been done. I don't know with what degree of success. That's the problem you find, but it is entirely possible within our range of existing scientific knowledge. Therefore, presumably with any kind of alien culture that ought to be slightly more advanced since they got this far, it ought to be a piece of cake for them. So is it possible they exist? Yes. Is there any actual, can you show me a hybrid? No. So I think it's one of those things. I mean, I think it's interesting that people entertain the idea, but it's one of those things that exists to me simply as a possibility. You know, keep in mind the possibility that something exists.
True.
And it's to sort of bring that back, I guess, you know, to the subject of Williamson.
Well, hold on a second, if you don't mind. Let me ask Justin Thomas's questions here.
Okay.
He wants to know, there's a few. Williamson possibly working with Majestic, MAJESTIC, which is supposedly the majority agency joint something.
Okay.
Magic 12, Majestic 12. That's one of the questions.
The committee that was supposedly set up by Harry Truman to study the UFO phenomenon, and then even further to, you know, collaborate with them, and then we get to underground bases and Dulce and Robert Lazar, and we go into those directions. Okay. If something like MJ12 existed, and that's an if, you know, because there are documents out there, but people dispute the validity of those documents. And I'll say that again is one of those things that is alleged. It is if it existed, he might very well have. But I could probably give you a simple example. If Williamson is involved, and I think to some degree, which is not stating as a fact, but I think my sort of operative assumption at this point is that at various times and to some degree, Williamson is involved in many ways in dispensing disinformation and collecting information about what was going on. He was either most likely working, the most obvious agency he was working for was simply a FOSI, the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. All right? And it would be an easy liaison because he has, you know, a background in the Army Air Force. He then has this long association with the Civil Air Patrol as a civilian auxiliary, you know, not part of the Air Force itself. I mean, in as late as 1965, when he's connected in Florida using the name Deprogrammed, still with the Civil Air Patrol, that he's based outside of Orlando in an Air Force. In fact, he's incongruously in a press report referred to as the wing training officer at Orlando Air Force Base.
Huh. Okay.
Now, you see, that's one of those things where I don't know whether they're talking about a Civil Air Patrol position or whether he is actually a captain involved in wing training. But he's doing this out of an Air Force base in the same way that when he's connected with the Civil Air Patrol in Tucson back in 1949, well, they're based, you know, in what will become Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. So here's this guy who has this kind of ambiguous connection with the military for years, is connected consistently and constantly rising in ranks in the civilian auxiliary to the U.S. Air Force. He is often in and around Air Force bases, and then who was also very heavily involved for years in the whole UFO phenomenon. And what I tend to see in that, looking at it from my perspective, is I tend to see somebody who's there, you know, in a sense, to sort of keep tabs on what's going on. Mm-hmm. And that much of what he does otherwise
right?
is
spy.
He's a spy. Well, here's something else to think about. One of the people again he's connected with is someone we mentioned, George Van Tassel. Remember, pilot for Howard Hughes, who then buys Giant Rock Airport. What does George Van Tassel become most famous for? I guess besides building the Integratron, while hosting the interplanetary spacecraft conventions every year in the spring at Giant Rock. And these are things that draw usually thousands of people, you know, and Williamson is there on a regular basis talking, and Adamski shows up, and everybody who's anybody and people who aren't show up. You know, all of the flying saucer fanatics show up to go to Giant Rock and exchange information. Now, if you wanted to have a kind of one-stop shop every year to pick up all the rumors and everything else flowing through this flying saucer emergent community, if you wanted to tap into the zeitgeist of the UFO, that would be the place to do it.
It's true. Very much so.
That way you would find out everything is saying, and it comes back to the question: is that why Williamson is there on a regular basis? But maybe more importantly, is that why George Van Tassel started the whole thing in the first place?
And it's even alleged now that each one of these conventions does have one of those military people, or you could say MIB, a military officer, or somebody to keep tabs on what's being presented.
Yeah. But you would have two types. You would have the people who would be the obvious military types that people would see,
yes.
Okay, and which they might say something to and they wouldn't, but the way that you ought to do it is that those people are a kind of distraction, and then you have, let's say, your infiltration agents, people who are trusted within the community, people who others would talk to, people who would believe that these aren't possibly unsympathetic, cynical, hostile men in black Army or Air Force officers, but this is someone who is a fellow contactee like myself, someone who has gained their trust. And there again, it doesn't mean that that's what he had to be, but George Hunt Williamson was perfect for the role if he wanted to play it. And here was a guy who liked to play roles.
Let me ask you this. Justin Thomas had another few more questions. Let me see if I could find the right one that I wanted to ask you. Okay, this is about when we were talking about wandering bishops. He wants to know, were and are they the Knights Templar / Malta?
Well, okay, not the Knights Templar, but he's onto something when he connects some of the wandering bishops, not all of them, to the Knights of Malta. And guess what other sort of secret order, that as Michel de Brunovich, that Williamson would join in the 1960s? The Knights of Malta. But not any Knights of Malta. And here again, you gotta, have a kind of, roster to know one Knights of Malta from the other. There were the original Knights of Malta, the Knights of St. John, the Knights Hospitallers, who were contemporaries and rivals of the Templars. Yes, they go all the way back to the Crusades. Unlike the Templars, the Knights of St. John did not get broken up or toasted or turned into Freemasons. Instead, they continued to evolve over the centuries. They eventually, by the 19th century, had become a kind of lay order. Okay, originally it was a monastic order. They became a lay order. But they also split into a lot of separate groups. So here's the thing today. If you start hunting after Knights of Malta, it's a house of many rooms. There are different groups. There is the mainstream Knights of Malta, the group with I'd say the fair claim to being the descendant of the original Knights of Malta is today the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, or SMOM, S-M-O-M. And the Sovereign Military Order of Malta is just that. It is a sovereign military order under the authority of the Vatican. I think it used to issue its own passports, because as a sovereign military order, it means you actually function like your own country. They don't own the island of Malta, although they still... But what they really are, the thing to remember is that the Knights of Malta are the Knights of St. John. And so one of the things you want to look for, the thing to me that really tipped off the allegiance of Williamson de Brunovich to this was that later on, among his various titles, he would add the initials OSJ after his name, Order of St. John. The other thing that people can look for is the initials SOSJ, which is the Sovereign Order of St. John. Now, the thing is that that's not the same, and anyone who uses that title can call themselves Knights of Malta, but the group that he was connected with wasn't the SMOM. It wasn't the mainstream, I think, arguably to say, legitimate Sovereign Military Order of Malta. It was a small American schism, which is, to separate it from all the others, is called the Shikshinny Knights of Malta.
Huh.
Shikshinny, and it's named after a little town in Pennsylvania, Shikshinny, Pennsylvania, because that's where it had its headquarters. And so the Shikshini Knights were the ones that then later, what they did, or I won't say what they did, what one guy did. Okay, if you get into the Shikshini Knights, we get into another case of a con man, all right? And this is a guy whose name was Charles Pitchell, P-I-C-H-E-L. Sometimes they like to pronounce it Pichel because it sounded, more French. But Charles Pitchell was an American, and he basically created the Shikshini Knights, or his Sovereign Order of St. John of Jerusalem, in the 1950s. In fact, I think specifically in 1956. So, oddly enough, it comes into creation around the same time. So what he did is that his background was, well, among other things, he was an ex-con who'd done time in the 20s for violating the Narcotics Act.
Ooh.
Yes, okay. So he was a former drug pusher.
In the 20s, that's not long after everything became illegal. I mean, in 1900 or 1890, I think you could still buy Coca-Cola with cocaine in it.
Yeah, you could give your babies opium. I mean,
yeah.
You could,
and
all the drugs were free.
Mothers definitely did that so they could get them to sleep and stop crying, etc.
They did indeed. So in the 20s, there were federal narcotics acts that came along, and I don't know which one he crossed. Before that, his actual training was as a pharmacist. So he was a pharmacist and knew his way around drugs. In the 20s, he broke some federal laws and went to prison for a while. And then when he got out, he started inventing and selling phony heraldry. One of these things like, well, research your family back. I don't know, maybe see if you're descended from the royalty of Serbia. But he would come up with this kind of phony heraldry and sell people, concocted histories of their family background for some obscene amount of money, or probably not all that much. And that's where he seems to have gotten the idea as to how to do this. But the other thing about Pitchell, since we've gone down this rabbit hole, is that he wasn't just an ex-con, drug dealer, fraudster. He also became an ardent pro-Nazi during the 1930s. I mean, so ardent of a pro-Nazi that he tried to write a letter to Adolf Hitler saying that he would be his emissary to the American people. I don't think he got a reply.
Yeah, I would think so, right?
What he did end up connected with, though, is he eventually sort of found his way into a movement called the Silver Legion of America, also known as the Silver Shirts. And the Silver Shirts were one of many, but one of the more prominent of the many sort of Nazi imitators in America in the 1930s. And, they wore silver shirts and marched around. I think at their peak there were 15 or 20,000 members of the organization. It pretty much faded away just before World War II became along. But it was headed by a guy by the name of William Dudley Pelley. Okay, so I know a lot of names are coming out. So we were talking about Pitchell, who's the guy that would later form the Shikshini Knights of Malta. But back before World War II, Pitchell was a follower of another guy whose name began with P, William Dudley Pelley. And Pelley, let's just say, was the founder of the Silver Shirts. He was a mystic. He engaged in automatic writing and channeling of ascended masters, beings that sounded a lot like what space people, in fact, would later sound like. And he formed the Silver Legion of America, ran for president, didn't win. And then during World War II, he was actually jailed for sedition. And then he was released from prison in 1950. And then because he was forbidden by the terms of his parole to engage in politics, he turned to metaphysics, and guess what? Flying saucers. And George Hunt Williamson, in 1954, goes to work as an editor for Pelley's magazine, which was called Valor. All right? And what Pelley had done is that he had turned his former sort of Aryan ascended masters, basically a ripoff of Theosophy. that he had talked about back in the 20s and the 30s, and he now just kind of repackaged them as benevolent space Aryans who are now sort of, again, trying to spiritually uplift up to humanity. And that's where Williamson gets some of his religion, but it brings Williamson into Pelley's orbit, into the same orbit that Pitchell had been into, and at about the same time that Williamson is getting more and more involved in the flying saucer subculture, Pitchell, another former follower of the fascist Pelley, is now forming this, sort of semi-imaginary Shikshini Knights of Malta. But then who tends to join that organization? So later on in the 60s, when as Michel Deprogrammed, the former Williamson, will join this Knights of Malta Order of St. John, who else are members of it? Well, that's where it really gets interesting, because the people who tend to join this little outfit, and it's not very big, are almost exclusively former military and intelligence officers. All of them. And one of those officers, who is a member of the same organization as the former Judge George Hunt Williamson, that same Order of St. John, Shikshini Knights of Malta, is a fellow by the name of Colonel Philip Corso.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that, because unfortunately we do have about 10 minutes left, and I was hoping you could get to that, because that person is a game changer. The Honorable Paul Hellyer would not be speaking had it not been for Philip Corso's book.
Yeah. So you've got Corso, who, again, as an officer, involved with Roswell. I mean, most famous for writing The Day After Roswell towards the end of his, a guy who had been involved in, arguably had first been involved in trying to debunk or discredit UFO sightings early on, then later writes a book claiming that, yes, this really did happen. And then, if you looked back in the 50s, you would find Williamson apparently on sort of one side of the flying saucer divide and Corso on the other. Yet in the 1960s, you find both of them in the same secret society composed of other military officers and retired or semi-retired spooks. And what exactly they're doing in this organization is never entirely clear. I mean, why does this organization exist? Why do these people find it necessary to form this kind of special club, and why are only certain people let into it? See, that's one of those things, again, that makes me think that George Hunt Williamson, later Michel Deprogrammed, was a more important figure than he lets on. And by being more important, I mean something much more than an early UFO contactee. My suspicion, and the thing that I want to do more research, and, if I'm going to write a book, I want to make a big good case for this. My suspicion is that he was the active, both intelligence gathering and disinformation spreading agent, either of the Air Force Office of Special Investigations or the CIA. And one of the reasons why I suspect the CIA is that, even though we're running out of time, one of the other things that Williamson does during his career, even as Williamson, is that he goes off to Peru, and he makes trips through Europe. It's interesting that he shows up supposedly in Peru to found a monastery to make contact with the aliens in the Andes and the other sort of ascended spiritual masters who by this time have all sort of become one thing, apparently, in his version of it. But he shows up in Peru just as it's undergoing a lot of political discontent. In fact, there are military coups and revolutions that take place. And I find it interesting that he and his wife and his little band of followers pull up stakes in Arizona and go off to the Andes just when all of these other politically interesting things are happening in Peru. And, nobody would pay much attention to a lot of, gringo weirdos, except one of them was actually there to sort, and you again have to remember what it was that as an intelligence gathering asset he would need to do. The main thing you need to do is you need to keep your mouth shut and your eyes and ears open. You need to simply watch what's going on around you, talk to people, collect the scuttlebutt, collect the raw intelligence and send it on to an analyst somewhere else to see how that compares to other information that they have. So I find it very interesting that Williamson, the spiritual seeker and flying saucer chaser, shows up in South America just at the time as other things very worldly are going on. And when you could begin to combine that with other things of where he just happens to be and who he happens to know and who is he connected to, there is this kind of leitmotif through his career. And despite the fact that he changes his name, that he erases George Hunt Williamson and becomes this other person, he maintains that unbroken connection to the Civil Air Patrol, to the civilian auxiliary of the U.S. Air Force. He's always, at every moment, just one step away from them, and I want to figure out what that means.
So do I. So do I. And it's so sad that we're almost coming to a close because people are writing here that this could go on for 3 or 4 hours. You're always coming back to my show. You're always welcome. But on this guy, we have to talk more about him. Now, what else can you tell the people? I guess leave them with I don't want to say a cliffhanger, but what else can we feed them in the next 5 minutes that could sort of encapsulate not just what you said, but what's more to come and what more research you have? Because that, I know, like I said, 3 or 4 hours may not even be enough.
Well, I mentioned earlier on that he tends to connect himself to a lot of people. So one of the things is that when he makes this transition from being George Hunt Williamson to becoming Michelle Dobrinovich, he doesn't do it all at once. So one of the things that I found, again, basically just going through the record of his press appearances and the talks that he gave, is that during the course of 1961, he sort of is both people. That is, he'll actually show up in one place and claim to be Michelle Dobrinovich and say, oh, George Hunt Williamson was just my pen name. My name has always been Michelle Dobrinovich. It wasn't. And in other cases, he's just, through the whole year, he's George Hunt Williamson. And also I think it's during that year that he flies into Houston. I've got an arrival, and he's coming in from Mexico City. And there, he's resorted back to being George Leonard Williamson, probably because that's what his passport said he was. So in the space of 1 year, he's actually appearing under all 3 of these names. But by 1962, he's completely dropped it. One of the things that I figured out is that usually if you read about him, it will say he had 2 wives. Okay, the first one was Betty Jane Hetler, who he married. They had this kind of student romance. I mean, it was really sort of cute. They were students at Eastern New Mexico State University and involved in drama productions, by the way. And she seems to actually have had some real academic background, and she was sort of drawn into his orbit, and they got married in 1949. She tragically died in 1958. And in fact, one of the things that I think I can say that I solved is that there were various stories. If you look around in the literature, wherever her name comes up, it's sometimes implied that she died mysteriously in Peru, that she may have fallen off a cliff, or that there were suspicions of foul play. What I found, due to the miracle of the internet and the digitization of records, was the actual record of her death compiled by the U.S. Embassy. One of the things that happens if you're an American and you die abroad, usually the nearest American embassy or consulate will actually fill out a form, which is Registry of an American, dead abroad. And this was interesting because it gave the date of her death, which was August 11th, 1958. Her husband was long gone from Peru. He was off in Europe at that point on a speaking tour. Betty, I have to say, my sense of their relationship is that she was a woman ill-used by her husband, who seems to have sort of serially abandoned her, but she always seems to remain very close to. So, what did she die of? What did this report actually have to say about it? No, she did not die from falling off a cliff. She died from cardiac arrest due to rheumatic fever and malnutrition.
Wow.
And, I actually took that to a doctor friend of mine.
Malnutrition.
Well, his assumption was that the way you get rheumatic fever, generally, is that first you get strep throat.
Okay.
Right? And you get strep throat, and in some people, not in all, it causes the strep throat, if it goes on and becomes serious enough, will cause an autoimmune reaction. And that is when the body begins attacking its own tissues. So it's a kind of secondary effect from the strep infection. So any of you out there thought you didn't have enough to worry about with just strep throat could get rheumatic fever.
Jeez.
And what that does is that it can damage the heart. She may have had it before. It's actually described in the death record as acute rheumatic fever, which would imply that this was a case that resulted from a recent case of strep throat. But what the doctor friend of mine thought that this probably meant is that she simply got so sick that she couldn't keep any food down. And that had been going on but that would have to be an extended period of time. So his assumption was that she had been sick for some time, and then eventually died as a cumulative result of her body's autoimmune response to the staph infection and then to her inability to keep down nutrients. And the thing about this, I couldn't help it others, is that her husband, George Hunt, is nowhere around when this happens, and he does not return for months. Her mother has to come down from Arizona to get their young son and take him back with her. He later claimed that he picked his son up. He didn't. His mother-in-law did it. He doesn't even learn about this until weeks after she is dead. And, one assumption I saw early on is that, the reason that he changed his whole name was because of the intense grief that he felt over Betty's death. I see no evidence of that. His speaking continues unbroken. He never makes any attempt to recover her remains. I don't know. Here's another little grisly detail. In most cases, that since she died she died outside of Lima, but she was buried unembalmed in a local cemetery. And in those cases, generally the body has to remain in the ground for 2 years and become skeletized before it can be disinterred and taken home.
Because I would assume that maybe some of this is still living and eating at the body?
It could, they could still carry, but in other words, all of the flesh has to have completely decayed, and you have to get everything down to a skeleton, and then you can take the bones home, but you can't take a decomposing corpse home, which I think probably makes a fair amount of sense under those circumstances. But yeah, her end is really kind of sad. But he quickly recovers. He has apparently met another woman on his speaking tour, who he marries. So the assumption before was that he had 2 wives. He had Betty. And then later he had married, I think the woman you were referring to, a Hollywood actress, a kind of cowgirl actress by the name of Jennifer Holt.
Mm-hmm.
So if anybody's, a movie buff and you know who Tim Holt was, Treasure of the Sierra Madre, Jennifer Holt was his sister. And I guess you could say she was a B-movie actress, but she was a movie actress. And again, she had a fair amount of money, and she was the one that lived in, the posh suburb of Montecito outside Santa Barbara.
Oh, yes.
And he married her in 1973, but they were only married for about 4. She, by the way, had 8 husbands, so he was number 7.
I know when I was at UCSB, Montecito was the place. As a matter of fact, one day when I was at the Biltmore Hotel, taking my mother for lunch, Bill Clinton was checking out that morning. I didn't see him, obviously. Secret Service is all around that detail, but that's definitely a place where the elite go. Oprah Winfrey lives there. Montecito is one of the most expensive places to live in and shop in at that. Now,
it was,
I was just going to say we've gone over by 7 minutes, and I would love to continue this, Dr. Spence. So what can you say that would be a final statement to encompass what you said and plug in your info?
Well, okay, let me throw in a few things here. George Hunt Williamson is interesting to me, and I think it might be interesting to other people, not just because he was one of these early contactee figures in the whole UFO phenomenon, but because I think he was much more than that. He might indeed be a perfect example of some sort of strange psychological syndrome, but I think most of what he did deliberately, and most of it was for a purpose. And when there's a purpose, it's either his purpose or it's a purpose he is being directed to by someone else, and it's the latter part that I would really like to find out.
Like the CIA
also,
or spying for another country, right?
Well, here's the other thing that if we ever talk about this again,
we are.
Get to, when you bring in CIA and you bring in the 1950s and you bring in weird things happening, you bring up MK Ultra.
Oh yes.
So here's the question. And MK Ultra, moves over into the worlds of occultism and so much of this sort of occult. I mean, look, when you got people sitting around channeling aliens, by seances or Ouija boards, to me, that's occultism.
That's true.
Right?
Even
most
people would agree that using a Ouija board in itself is actually being involved in occultism right there. Just the fact that you're using a Ouija board. It doesn't matter who you're trying to contact or connect with or channel, but just using the Ouija board is considered to be one of the major divination tools in occult.
It is. It is certainly divination, and it fits into the long history of occult practices, and I find it very interesting that people who were claiming to be in contact with highly advanced aliens are using time-honored methods of magic to do so, which makes me wonder as to whether or not we're just looking at the same old thing in slightly new dress, or whether we're looking at something which is a fairly sophisticated, if very murky, mass psychological operation. There's an idea to think of. To what degree? Here's the idea. I think that in the early UFO, again, this is the standpoint of an agnostic, but I think that what's going on in the early UFO and probably the later UFO phenomenon, probably still going on, isn't one thing, but several things simultaneously. There are real experiences and there are fake experiences. There are people who are telling the truth and there are people who are lying. There are people who are lying because they don't know any better, and there are people who, I think, like Williamson, are lying for a deliberate purpose of disinformation. So there are a lot of things going on, and the whole concept of somewhere lurking within this a kind of mass psychological operation, well, maybe, but it's one of those things that I entertain the possibility that a connection exists, and we'll see what we can find.
And that's what we're going to keep on digging for. And you know what? I know you said you are going to write an article, and each time you don't want to write a book, I could see how this has so much information. It'll probably end up as a book. So I look forward to that.
Yeah, if I throw Parsons and other stuff into it, if I could plug one thing and just stretch the time even more, one thing I would plug is that one of the things that will be coming out this fall, hopefully. Any of you who know what the Great Courses is, these are non-credit sort of educational courses. I have completed the filming, and post-production is now for a 24-episode course on the real history of secret societies.
Nice.
And one of the people that actually gets mentioned in this briefly is George Hunt Williamson. So there, I've got my plug-in.
Also, your book, Secret Agent 666.
Yeah.
The Aleister Crowley being a double agent, that's actually how I found you. Ironically, remember I told you I actually bought that book, and then a couple weeks later I was sent a review copy. I was like, wow, this is cool.
You have two. Okay.
Yes, I have two. Anyhow, Dr. Spence, it's always a pleasure speaking to you. We will do this again. Everybody, I wish I had more time to give all the thanks, so I just want to thank to all the listeners, iHeartRadio, UPRN, all the people in YouTube, and remember, the only thing you need to remember is Dr. J Radio Live. With that being said, I have to sign off.